This young couple adopted a bear cub, now he thinks he's a house dog. Early one morning, soft sunlight filtered through the dense canopy of the forest in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. Mark Allen adjusted his camera lens, the familiar weight of the Canon EOS 1DX Mark III resting comfortably in his calloused hands. At 34, his work as a wildlife photographer had taken him to the most remote corners of the world, but there was something about these ancient mountains that always called him home. He'd been tracking a herd of white-tailed deer since dawn, moving silently through the underbrush. National Geographic had commissioned him for a documentary on the changing migration patterns of Appalachian wildlife, and this particular herd had been especially elusive. Mark settled into position behind a fallen oak, his breathing slow and controlled as he waited for the perfect moment. That's when he heard it, a faint cry echoing through the trees. At first, Mark thought it was a fledgling bird, perhaps fallen from its nest, but there was something unsettling about the sound, a plaintive quality that carried an unusual sense of despair. "That's not right," he whispered to himself, carefully setting his camera down. The deer would have to wait. Mark followed the sound, moving cautiously through the forest. After about 20 minutes of searching, he noticed something that made his stomach drop, a trail of blood, dark against the forest floor. As he continued, he found spent bullet casings scattered among chaotic footprints. The story told in the disturbed earth was clear: there had been a confrontation between a poacher and wildlife, and it hadn't ended well. When Mark found the bear, his worst fears were confirmed. The female black bear lay motionless, her dark fur matted with blood. Poachers had been increasingly active in the area despite the efforts of local conservation officers. Mark knelt beside the animal, his hand hovering over her still form. He didn't need to check for a pulse to know she was gone. The cry came again, weaker this time. Mark stood, scanning the area until his eyes fell on a hollow beneath a fallen tree. Approaching slowly, he knelt down and peered into the darkness. Two dark brown eyes stared back at him, wide with fear. "Hey there, little one," Mark said softly, his heart breaking as he took in the sight of the black bear cub. Its jet-black fur was wet from the previous night's rain and matted with mud. Blood stained its hind leg, which lay at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. Mark knew the protocol: you don't interfere with nature, you document, you observe, but you don't intervene. He'd built his career on that principle. But as he looked into the cub's frightened eyes, he couldn't bring himself to simply photograph its suffering and move on. "I'm sorry, buddy," he whispered, removing his jacket. "I know I shouldn't do this, but I can't leave you here." With gentle movements, Mark wrapped the jacket around the trembling cub, who was too weak and injured to put up much resistance. The small creature let out a pitiful whimper as Mark lifted him. "It's okay," Mark murmured. "My wife's going to fix you up." The drive to the Blue Ridge Wildlife Rescue Center took 40 minutes, during which the cub had fallen into an uneasy sleep in the passenger seat of Mark's truck. As he pulled into the gravel driveway of the center, he saw his wife Sarah walking between buildings, clipboard in hand. At 31, Sarah Allen had established herself as one of the most respected wildlife veterinarians in the state. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and even from a distance, Mark could see the familiar furrow between her brows that appeared whenever she was deep in thought. "Sarah," he called, carefully lifting the bundle from his truck. She turned, her expression shifting from surprise to concern as she took in the sight of her husband carrying something wrapped in his jacket. "Mark, what happened?" she asked, rushing toward him. "Poachers," he replied grimly. "Got the mother." This little guy's hurt bad, broken leg at least, maybe worse. Sarah's face hardened as she gently took the bundle from Mark's arms and peered at the cub. Exam 1, she said, already turning toward the building. I'll get Dr. Wilson and the team. What followed was the longest day of Mark's life. He paced the hallway outside the surgical suite, occasionally catching glimpses through the window as Sarah and her team worked to save the cub's life. The initial assessment had revealed injuries far worse than just a broken leg. The cub had a severely fractured pelvis, internal bleeding, and the beginnings of an infection that, left untreated, would have certainly killed him. Hour after hour passed. Staff members came and went, bringing supplies, taking away bloodied gauze. Mark fielded calls from his editor, explaining that he would need to reschedule the shoot. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows of the rescue center, Mark settled into an uncomfortable plastic chair, his eyes never leaving the door to the surgical suite. Finally, nearly 12 hours after they had begun, the door opened. Sarah emerged, her scrubs stained with blood, her face drawn with exhaustion. For a moment, she just stood there, and Mark felt his heart sink. Then she smiled, a tired, relieved smile that lit up her entire face. "He's going to make it," she said, her voice breaking. It was touch and go for a while, but he stabilized. Mark crossed the hallway in 2 strides, wrapping his arms around his wife. She collapsed against him, her professional composure finally giving way to the emotional toll of the day. He felt her shoulders shake as she sobbed against his chest. "You did it," he whispered into her hair. "You saved him." Sarah pulled back, wiping her eyes. "He's got an incredible will to live, Mark. I've never seen anything like it. Most cubs that young with injuries that severe," she shook her head. "He shouldn't have made it. But he fought so hard." "What happens now?" Mark asked. Sarah sighed, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "Normally, he'd go to a rehabilitation facility. But with injuries this severe, he'll need specialized care for weeks, maybe months. We could take him," Mark suggested, the words out of his mouth before he had fully considered them. Sarah stared at him. "Mark, he's a wild animal, a predator, not a pet." "I know that," he assured her. "But just until he's strong enough for rehab. You know how understaffed the center is. And our place isn't far. You could monitor his recovery, and I could document it. Think of the awareness it could raise about poaching." Sarah hesitated, clearly torn between professional protocol and the practical reality of their limited resources at the center. "Let me see what Dr. Wilson says," she finally replied. 2 days later, they brought the cub home. They had set up a makeshift recovery area in their sunroom with soft blankets, water, and the special formula Sarah had prepared. They decided to name him Bruno. Their home on the outskirts of Asheville was modest, a small 2-bedroom cottage with a large yard bordered by woods. It wasn't ideal for housing a bear cub, even temporarily, but it would have to do. "Remember," Sarah cautioned as they settled Bruno into his new space, "this is just until he's strong enough to transfer to a proper rehabilitation facility. A few weeks at most." Mark nodded, though he was already captivated by the small creature looking up at them with curious eyes. "Of course," he agreed, snapping a photo of Bruno exploring his blankets. "Just until he's stronger." Neither of them knew then how deeply Bruno would become entwined in their lives. The first few days were challenging. Bruno was in pain, confused, and terrified. He refused to eat, huddling in the corner of his enclosure, dark eyes wary whenever Mark or Sarah approached. Sarah spent hours sitting nearby, speaking in soft tones, patiently trying to coax him to take the bottle of formula. On the fourth day, they had a breakthrough. Sarah was dozing in a chair beside Bruno's enclosure when she felt something nudge her hand. Opening her eyes, she found Bruno sniffing at her fingers, his fear momentarily overcome by curiosity and hunger. "Mark," she whispered, not daring to move, "bring the bottle, slowly." Mark crept into the room with the prepared formula. With painstaking gentleness, Sarah offered it to Bruno, who, after a moment's hesitation, began to suckle greedily. "That's it," she encouraged, tears springing to her eyes. "Good boy, Bruno." From that moment, Bruno's recovery accelerated. His wounds began to heal, and his personality emerged, curious, playful, and surprisingly affectionate. Mark documented every moment, his camera capturing Bruno's first tentative steps after his cast was removed, his discovery of the joys of a kiddie pool filled with water, his fascination with the birds that visited the feeders outside the window. But the true transformation came when they introduced Bruno to Sunny and Buddy, their golden retriever puppies. The dogs had been staying with Sarah's sister while Bruno settled in, but they couldn't keep them away forever. "Are you sure about this?" Mark asked as Sarah brought the puppies into the house on leashes. "No," she admitted, "but they live here too, and we need to know if this is going to work." The initial meeting was tense. Sunny and Buddy, just 6 months old themselves, cowered behind Sarah's legs, whimpering at the strange scent and sight of the bear cub. Bruno, for his part, puffed himself up, trying to appear larger despite his small size and still healing injuries. "Easy," Sarah soothed, keeping the dogs on their leashes but allowing them to sniff in Bruno's direction from a safe distance. "It's okay, boys. That's just Bruno." For several days, they kept the interactions brief and supervised, but puppies being puppies are naturally curious and forgiving. It was Sunny who made the first overture, cautiously approaching Bruno with a wagging tail. Bruno watched, motionless, as the golden retriever sniffed at him. Then, in a moment that Mark was fortunate enough to capture on camera, Sunny gently licked Bruno's healing leg. The bear cub looked startled, then relaxed, reaching out a paw to touch Sunny's golden fur. "Would you look at that?" Mark whispered, not wanting to break the spell of the moment. After that, the three became inseparable. Bruno, having imprinted on the humans and dogs around him, began to mimic the puppies' behaviors. He would follow them around the house, watching intently as they played with toys, then attempting to join in. The sight of a bear cub trying to fetch a tennis ball, his movements still awkward from his healing injuries, became a regular occurrence in the Allen household. Weeks turned into months, and Bruno grew at an astonishing rate. By 6 months, he was already larger than Sunny and Buddy, his frame filling out with muscle as his health improved. Sarah's few weeks had long since passed, but every time they discussed transferring Bruno to a rehabilitation facility, they found reasons to delay. "He's still adapting to his mobility," Sarah would say, or "the stress of a new environment might set back his progress." The truth, though neither of them admitted it aloud, was that they had fallen in love with Bruno. He had become part of their family, his daily antics bringing joy and laughter into their home. Mark's documentation of Bruno's recovery had evolved into something more personal, a chronicle of an unusual family bonding through adversity. But as Bruno approached his first birthday, weighing over 100 pounds and growing stronger by the day, the limitations of their small home became increasingly apparent. Bruno, with the innocent destructiveness of a wild animal raised in captivity, broke through the makeshift enclosures they constructed, climbed on furniture until it collapsed under his weight, and swung from the branches of trees in their yard, sending neighbors into a panic when he ventured too close to property lines. "We need to do something," Sarah admitted one evening after Bruno had demolished their coffee table during what he clearly thought was a playful wrestling match with Buddy. "This isn't fair to him. And it's becoming dangerous." Mark nodded, looking at the wreckage of their living room. "I've been designing a stronger pen, but he doesn't want to be in a pen," Sarah finished. "He wants to be with us. With the dogs. He thinks he's a giant puppy." It was true. Despite his growing size and strength, Bruno's behavior had been shaped by his unusual upbringing. He played fetch with enthusiasm, though his version involved considerably more destruction than when the dogs did it. He tried to squeeze into the dog beds, despite being 3 times too large. And most endearingly, he would still curl up beside Mark and Sarah on the couch during movie nights, his large head resting in Sarah's lap as she stroked his fur. They were in uncharted territory. Bruno was neither fully wild nor truly domesticated, a black bear with the social behaviors of a golden retriever, growing larger and stronger every day, confined to a space far too small for his needs. Something would have to change, and soon. Neither Mark nor Sarah could have predicted just how dramatic that change would be. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday in April. Mark was away on a 2-day shoot in the mountains, and Sarah had left Bruno in the backyard enclosure while she worked a shift at the rescue center. When she returned home, the gate was broken and Bruno was gone. Panic seized her as she called Mark, who immediately started driving back. Sarah took the dogs, hoping their familiar scent might help locate Bruno. They searched the woods behind their property, calling his name, fear growing with each passing minute. A bear raised among humans and dogs would be vulnerable in the wild, but also potentially dangerous to people who didn't understand his unusual upbringing. The rain intensified as darkness fell, and Sarah was about to call the local authorities when Buddy began barking insistently, pulling at his leash. Following the golden retriever, Sarah pushed through wet underbrush until they emerged in a small clearing. There, standing beneath a massive oak tree, was Bruno. He was soaking wet, his black fur slick with rain, but it wasn't his appearance that made Sarah's breath catch, it was his demeanor. Bruno stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the tree, emitting low, mournful sounds unlike anything Sarah had heard from him before. Mark arrived minutes later, having parked on the nearest Forest Service road and followed Sarah's GPS location. "What's he doing?" he whispered, joining his wife at the edge of the clearing. "I don't know," Sarah replied. "He hasn't moved since we found him." As they watched, Bruno rose on his hind legs, placing his front paws against the trunk of the oak. He let out a long, sorrowful call that echoed through the forest, a sound so primal and full of longing that it sent shivers down Sarah's spine. "Mark," she said slowly, recognition dawning, I think this is where you found him. Where his mother died." Mark stared at the clearing with new eyes, taking in details he hadn't noticed in his concern for Bruno, the fallen log that had provided shelter for the orphaned cub, the distinctive fork in the trunk of the oak tree. This was indeed the place where, nearly a year ago, he had discovered a frightened cub beside his poached mother. How did he find it? Mark wondered aloud. How did he remember? Bruno called out again, his cry mingling with the sound of rain on leaves. In that moment, Mark and Sarah glimpsed something they had been unable or unwilling to see before, the wild heart that still beat within their beloved Bruno. Despite his playful antics with the dogs, despite his comfort in human company, He carried within him the memory of his origins and the instinctive longing for his true nature. "Bruno," Sarah called softly, taking a step into the clearing, "come on, boy. Let's go home." Bruno turned, his dark eyes finding hers through the rain. For a moment, he seemed caught between worlds, the wild forest around him and the human family calling him back. Then, with one last look at the oak tree, he lumbered towards Sarah, pressing his wet body against her legs like an oversized dog seeking comfort. The incident shook both Mark and Sarah profoundly. That night, after Bruno had been settled back at home, they sat at their kitchen table, hands wrapped around mugs of cooling coffee. "We can't keep going like this," Mark said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "It's not right for him." Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know. I've always known, really. I just didn't want to admit it." The next day, they contacted Dr. Reina Martinez, a specialist in black bear behavior who worked with several wildlife sanctuaries across the state. After hearing their unusual situation, she agreed to visit and assess Bruno. Dr. Martinez spent hours observing Bruno's interactions with the humans and dogs, taking notes and occasionally asking questions about his behaviors and routines. Her conclusion, delivered with compassionate directness, confirmed what Mark and Sarah had begun to accept. "Bruno exists in a liminal space," she explained, watching as the bear playfully batted at a ball Buddy had dropped at his feet. "He's imprinted on humans and dogs, which means releasing him into the wild would be dangerous, both for him and potentially for humans he might encounter. He lacks the survival skills and appropriate fear responses." "So what are our options?" Mark asked. Dr. Martinez sighed. "Most sanctuaries wouldn't be equipped to handle an animal with his unusual socialization. He would be isolated from other bears, who might react aggressively to his atypical behaviors, and separated from the dogs and humans he considers his family. The stress alone could cause significant health issues." "What about zoos?" Sarah suggested, though the word felt wrong as soon as she said it. "Possibly. But the same issues apply. Bruno needs more space than your yard provides, but he also needs the social connections he's formed. It's a complex situation." After Dr. Martinez left, Mark and Sarah sat on their porch swing, watching Bruno and the dogs chase each other around the yard. The bear moved with surprising grace despite his size, careful never to knock over the much smaller golden retrievers, even in the excitement of play. "I've been thinking," Mark said slowly. "What if we moved? Found a place with more land, somewhere remote enough that Bruno could have space without neighbors to worry about." Sarah looked at him, surprise giving way to consideration. "You're talking about completely changing our lives, for a bear?" "For a member of our family," Mark corrected gently. The decision wasn't made lightly. It meant Sarah would have a longer commute to the rescue center. Mark would need to convert part of any new property into a home office for editing his photographs. They would be leaving behind the first home they had purchased together, the place where they had planned to eventually start a human family. But when they looked at Bruno, at the joy he brought them, at the remarkable bond he shared with Sonny and Buddy, at the trust he placed in them, the decision became clear. 3 months later, they sold their house and purchased a 7-acre farm on the outskirts of Pisgah National Forest. The property was perfect, remote enough to provide privacy, with rolling meadows, a small stream, and enough woodland to give Bruno a taste of his natural habitat. Mark worked with wildlife experts to design a semi-wild enclosure that encompassed nearly 5 acres, complete with climbing structures, a deep pool for swimming, and dens for shelter. Moving day was chaotic. Bruno, sensing the upheaval, became anxious and clingy, following Sarah from room to room as she packed boxes. The dogs picked up on his distress, their usual playfulness subdued as they watched their belongings disappear into moving trucks. "It's okay," Sarah assured them all, kneeling to ruffle Buddy's golden fur while Bruno pressed against her side. "You're going to love the new place, so much room to run and play." The transition wasn't easy. Bruno, accustomed to the familiar surroundings of their small home, refused to enter the new house for days, hiding instead beneath the porch, emerging only when Sarah or Mark brought food, or when the mice came to coax him out with playful nudges. "Give him time," Mark said, watching as Bruno finally ventured a few steps into the kitchen, sniffing cautiously at the unfamiliar space. Purchased a 7-acre farm on the outskirts of Pisgah National Forest, the property was perfect, remote enough to provide privacy, with rolling meadows, a small stream, and enough woodland to give Bruno a taste of his natural habitat. Mark worked with wildlife experts to design a semi-wild enclosure that encompassed nearly 5 acres, complete with climbing structures, a deep pool for swimming, and dens for shelter. Moving day was chaotic. Bruno, sensing the upheaval, became anxious and clingy, following Sarah from room to room as she packed boxes. The dogs picked up on his distress, their usual playfulness subdued as they watched their belongings disappear into moving trucks. "It's okay," Sarah assured them all, kneeling to ruffle Buddy's golden fur while Bruno pressed against her side. "You're going to love the new place, so much room to run and play." The transition wasn't easy. Bruno, accustomed to the familiar surroundings of their small home, refused to enter the new house for days, hiding instead beneath the porch, emerging only when Sarah or Mark brought food, or when the mice came to coax him out with playful nudges. "Give him time," Mark said, watching as Bruno finally ventured a few steps into the kitchen, sniffing cautiously at the unfamiliar space. "This is a big change for all of us." Gradually, day by day, Bruno began to explore his new environment. The first time he discovered the stream, his reaction was transformative. Mark, who had been following at a distance with his camera, captured the moment. Bruno waded into the water, his initial caution giving way to unbridled joy as he splashed and rolled in the cool current. "Sarah!" Mark called, unable to contain his excitement. "Come see this." Bruno's adaptation to their new home continued to unfold in surprising ways. He discovered the pleasure of climbing the sturdy oaks that dotted their property, something their small yard had never allowed. He spent hours sunning himself on flat rocks beside the stream or digging in the soft earth for grubs and roots, natural behaviors they had rarely seen him exhibit before. Most remarkably, his destructive tendencies diminished. With space to roam and natural outlets for his energy and curiosity, Bruno no longer felt the need to dismantle furniture or break through enclosures. He seemed, for perhaps the first time in his unusual life, truly content. Their routine evolved with the seasons. During the day, Bruno would explore his enclosure, often with Sunny and Buddy as companions. The dogs had adapted to their new home with typical canine resilience, finding endless fascination in the smells and sounds of rural life. In the evenings, Bruno would return to the house, where a special reinforced door had been installed to accommodate his growing frame, now approaching 250 pounds. Mark's documentation of their journey had gained an unexpected following. What had begun as a personal record of Bruno's recovery had evolved into a compelling narrative about conservation, the consequences of poaching, and the complex relationship between humans and wildlife. His photographs, Bruno napping with Sunny and Buddy in a patch of sunlight, Bruno catching fish in the stream with surprising dexterity, Bruno gently taking treats from Sarah's hand, captured the imagination of viewers around the world. Sarah too had found a new outlet for her passion. She started a blog chronicling their experiences, offering insights into Bruno's health, behavior, and development. Together, they used their platform to advocate for stronger anti-poaching measures and support for wildlife rehabilitation centers. "It's not the life we planned," Sarah remarked one evening as they sat on their new, much larger porch swing, watching Bruno and the dogs play in the twilight, "but I wouldn't trade it for anything." Mark squeezed her hand, silently agreeing. Their unusual family had found its balance, a harmony born of compromise, adaptation, and love. But as Bruno entered his 4th year, subtle changes began to appear in his behavior. He spent more time alone, venturing to the farthest corners of his enclosure. His playful interactions with the dogs became less frequent, though no less affectionate when they did occur, and sometimes, on quiet evenings, they would find him standing at the fence line, gazing into the depths of the forest beyond with an expression that could only be described as longing. It was Dr. Martinez, during one of her regular visits to check on Bruno's progress, who finally put words to what Mark and Sarah had been reluctant to acknowledge. "He's maturing," she explained gently. "Black bears are solitary by nature, particularly males. The fact that he's maintained such strong social bonds this long is remarkable, but his instincts are asserting themselves." "What does that mean for his future?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Dr. Martinez hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "There's a new sanctuary that's opened in the Great Smoky Mountains. They have nearly 1,000 acres, much of it natural forest habitat. Several of the bears there have similar backgrounds to Bruno, raised in captivity or rehabilitated after injuries, unable to return fully to the wild but needing more space and natural conditions than most facilities can provide. You think we should send him there?" Mark said. It wasn't a question. "I think you should consider it," Dr. Martinez replied. "Bruno would have the opportunity to interact with other bears, if he chooses, or to maintain the solitude many adult males prefer. He would have more space to roam, more opportunities to express natural behaviors." And she added, seeing the pain in their expressions, "The sanctuary allows limited visitation from previous caretakers. You wouldn't be saying goodbye forever." That night, after Dr. Martinez had gone, Mark and Sarah sat by the fire pit in their yard, watching the flames dance while Bruno and the dogs dozed nearby. "What do you think?" Mark finally asked, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Sarah wiped away a tear, her gaze fixed on Bruno's sleeping form. "I think we've always known this day would come. We've just been postponing it because it hurts too much to think about." "He seems happy here," Mark argued, though his tone lacked conviction. "He's content," Sarah corrected gently. "But have you seen the way he looks at the forest? The way he stands at the fence line? He deserves more than contentment, Mark. He deserves to live as fully as a bear can, given his circumstances." Deep down, Mark knew she was right. Their love for Bruno had always been tinged with the knowledge that he was a wild creature, that their home, no matter how adapted to his needs, could never fully satisfy the instincts that ran through his veins. The decision, once made, brought a strange mix of grief and peace. They arranged for Bruno's transfer to the Great Smoky Bear Sanctuary, working closely with the staff to ensure the transition would be as smooth as possible. Mark and Sarah would be allowed to accompany him for the first few days, helping him adjust to his new surroundings before gradually withdrawing their presence. On Bruno's last morning with them, the air held the crisp promise of autumn. Mark rose early, camera in hand, determined to capture these final hours together. He found Bruno already awake, sitting beside the stream, watching the sunrise with what seemed like contemplative awareness. "Hey big guy," Mark said softly, sitting beside him on the bank. "Big day today." Bruno turned, dark eyes finding Mark's with the deep connection that had formed between them over 4 remarkable years. He bumped his massive head gently against Mark's shoulder, an affectionate gesture that had remained consistent from his days as a small, frightened cub. Sarah joined them, Sunny and Buddy trotting at her heels. They spent the morning together as a family, walking the property one last time. Bruno seemed to sense the significance of the day, staying close, occasionally stopping to sniff at a familiar tree or rock as if committing the scent to memory. When it was time to leave, they loaded Bruno into the specialized transport vehicle. The sanctuary staff had been clear, this needed to be a clean break. Extended goodbyes would only confuse Bruno and make the transition harder. At the sanctuary, they walked with Bruno to the acclimation enclosure, where he would spend his first few weeks. Beyond its boundaries stretched forests and meadows, streams and caves, a world where Bruno could finally live according to his nature. "This is it, buddy," Sarah whispered, kneeling beside him. Bruno nuzzled into her chest, his movements gentle despite his enormous size and strength. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur, unable to hold back her tears. Mark knelt beside them, his hand resting on Bruno's massive shoulder. "You're going to be okay," he said, his voice breaking. "Better than okay, you're going to be what you were always meant to be." Bruno looked between them, then turned his attention to Sunny and Buddy, who had been unusually subdued throughout the journey. He lowered his head, gently touching noses with each dog in a gesture that seemed unmistakably like goodbye. Then, with one final look at the human family who had saved his life and shaped his world, Bruno turned and lumbered into the acclimation enclosure. At the far end, a small opening led to a wooded area where he would begin his new life. Without hesitation, Bruno moved toward it, his powerful body disappearing into the dappled shadows of the forest. Mark raised his camera one last time, capturing that final image, Bruno shrinking into the distance among the trees, the golden afternoon light gently falling on his back. The photo would later become the cover of his book, Bruno, Two Worlds. On the long drive home, Mark and Sarah remained mostly silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Tears came and went, but beneath the sorrow was a current of profound peace. They had done the right thing, not just for Bruno, but for themselves. Loving something, truly loving it, sometimes meant letting it go. 6 months later, they received a video from the sanctuary staff. Bruno had fully acclimated to his new home, establishing a territory near a mountain stream reminiscent of the one on their property. He remained uniquely comfortable around the human caretakers, often approaching the observation platforms when staff were present. But he had also begun to exhibit more natural bear behaviors, foraging extensively, creating seasonal dens, even interacting cautiously with some of the female bears in adjacent territories. "He remembers who he is," Sarah said softly as they watched the footage of Bruno climbing a tall pine with powerful, confident movements. "But I think he remembers us too." Mark nodded, his arm tightening around her shoulders. On the floor at their feet, Sunny and Buddy dozed, occasionally twitching in their sleep. Their family had changed, evolved, but the love that had brought them together, that had saved a small broken cub and transformed all their lives in the process, remained as strong as ever. Outside their window, the Blue Ridge Mountains stood silhouetted against the evening sky, ancient and enduring. Somewhere within a similar landscape, Bruno roamed free, carrying with him the unique legacy of his time between worlds and the indelible mark of having been, for a brief and beautiful chapter, part of a most unusual family.